Hello and welcome back. This is the Week 8 lecture. So today we're looking at Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail. And as I mentioned in the module, I want us to approach this text in the same way that we have been approaching the fiction and even the poetry that we've been reading this semester. Might seem like a little bit of a departure from a lot of the other readings that we've been doing, mainly because this would generally be considered nonfiction. Like, this is not a fictional story that King is telling. Obviously, the events that he's discussing in the text are real. The people, by and large, are real. He might mention a literary character or two, but I think most of the people he's mentioning are real people. These are real events and obviously real issues that were important during that time. So we've often made a distinction between fiction and nonfiction has not always come under the same level of consideration or analysis. But that is beginning to change, and I've kind of already mentioned this earlier in the semester. We have sort of expanded our definitions for what constitutes literature. Traditionally, we would have thought of literature as really only consisting of novels, short stories, poetry, and plays. And indeed, we still kind of teach literature that way. If you took my 203 class or if you took many others, that structure still kind of exists. I mean, we might spend a little bit of time on creative nonfiction or even, genre fiction, obviously, like we did last week. But we will sort of acknowledge oftentimes that, hey, there's sort of new conceptual categories when it comes to literature that might not be fully accounted for with those old categorizations, those old classifications. Now people talk about maybe graphic novels as being sort of a new or newer type of literature. Again, creative nonfiction will often be considered sort of literary in many ways, and other types of writing as well. Memoirs, any kind of biographical writing. Often, again, those are sort of taken as nonfiction. They're taken as more factual, but we can often locate a lot of literary elements, a lot of literary techniques that would also show up in novels, short stories, or maybe even poetry. Even some, long form journalism often takes on certain literary characteristics that we might notice as we are reading. So I thought it might be good to turn our critical eyes to this particular text, which is obviously quite famous. There's a good chance many of you have read it before. I don't think that's a problem, though. As we know, it's often necessary to read a text multiple times, especially if it's a relatively long or complex text. And this is pretty complex. King is really throwing a lot of ideas at us here. He's responding to specific people, so we're going to talk about that. But like they say in the intro in the book, this is kind of a public letter or an open letter. Yes, he is responding directly to these moderate white clergymen who had sort of spoken against him and criticized him and his methods. But really, this letter is not only intended for them. This letter is also intended for the wider reading public, and of course it's still taught, it's still read and studied today. And I also wanted to just talk a little bit about King, since he is our author here. And I think, a good way to approach this, he's obviously a very familiar figure, and we all know him, and we all have learned about him. We've probably seen clips of some of his speeches, and maybe we've even read some of his work. Again, this is one of his more famous pieces of writing, so it's likely that we've come across it before. But I do want to just mention that, before we get into the text, if we're thinking a little bit about context, if we're thinking a little bit about social and historical context, some things that might help us to understand the letter, I think we need to start a little bit with King and a little bit with kind of what was going on at this point in time when he's writing this letter. Who is he responding to? Why is he responding? What is he doing? Who is he affiliated with? And what are some of the techniques and methods of his that are being criticized by these white clergymen who he is responding to. I think something that's kind of interesting about King, our current sort of pop culture consumption of him, is I would argue maybe a little bit simplified, in some ways maybe a little bit sanitized. He's almost taken on this kind of saintly status, which, there's lots of good reasons for that. I'm not necessarily criticizing that, but I think a lot of Americans have kind of an overly simplified view of King and sort of what he did, and also how he was perceived during his time. Public opinion has obviously turned in his favor since he died or was assassinated at the end of the 1960s. But we need to sort of remind ourselves, and this letter will serve as a reminder, that he was not necessarily received so positively when he was active throughout the 1950s and 1960s in the civil rights movement. He was obviously opposed by staunch, virulent racists. I mean, we all know that. Obviously, organizations like the KKK were not fond of him. But what this letter also indicates is that there were more moderate critics who weren't necessarily burning crosses in yards or doing anything that extreme, but they still opposed King's methods. And I think when we talk about him today, we don't always discuss a lot of his sort of philosophical tenets, some of his really deep-seated beliefs. Like I said, we kind of simplify him and we act like all he really ever did was talk about racial equality in sort of a general idealistic way, when in reality he had a lot more sort of specific aims, some more specific techniques or strategies that were being criticized during his time. Now we generally look at them positively, but it's important to remember with this letter, the clergymen that he's responding to were specifically criticizing his methods of nonviolent direct action. And I think we have sort of a vague sense of what that term means, but again, I don't think it gets discussed in a lot of detail. And a lot of discussions about King, we just sort of mention protesting or demonstrating. We might mention the Montgomery bus boycott that he participated in the 1950s. I think I mentioned that event when we were discussing A Raisin in the Sun. So we might kind of have an awareness of some of that stuff. We know that he led some marches and other things of that nature. And if we've studied him a little bit, or if we're maybe a little bit more familiar with him, we might know that he was a practitioner of nonviolence. He was sort of a follower of Gandhi and others who had practiced nonviolence and also civil disobedience. Some of you might be familiar with that concept. Again, and King's sort of a part of a long, rich lineage. He wasn't inventing these concepts. He was inspired by previous sort of civil rights leaders like Gandhi, but even other American writers and thinkers like Henry David Thoreau, for example, who was a practitioner of civil disobedience in his own right, and wrote about it and talked about it. And civil disobedience is just sort of a general term for instances where people refuse to follow certain laws, but they're generally doing it in a civil, nonviolent way. So I might be getting some of these details wrong, but in the example of Thoreau, I believe he was protesting the Mexican-American War or something, and I'm not sure exactly what he did, but he might have ended up in jail briefly. But a good example would be refusing to report if you are drafted into military service. And of course, this happened a fair amount, particularly during the Vietnam War, where there were a lot of objectors, conscientious objectors and others who didn't agree with the war and didn't want to fight. So burning your draft card, or maybe just refusing to report, or I don't know, maybe one would even consider fleeing to Canada as sort of a form of civil disobedience. Yeah, you're breaking the law, but you're doing it in a nonviolent way, and sometimes you might be citing religious, moral, ethical reasons for why you're refusing to comply with that particular law. And King talks about this concept of, this sort of dichotomy between just laws and unjust laws. And he argues that all Americans should follow just laws, but we actually have an obligation to resist and refuse unjust laws so we can get rid of them and create a more just, equitable society. So a lot of concepts that he's talking about in this letter, like I said, they have a long history in American thought or in other struggles for freedom and equality throughout the world. So that's something that we'll definitely notice as we work through the letter, is King is drawing on a lot of references, right? He references a lot of historical figures, philosophers, figures from the Bible, but also contemporary figures. He references a lot of what would have been current events back when he was writing this. So we'll notice that a little bit more as we move along, but you should just have a general sense of kind of what nonviolent direct action is and sort of what it consisted of. So generally, it has a pretty broad applicability, but these are sort of the following activities that are often considered like prime examples of nonviolent direct action. So marches or demonstrations, boycotts. So these could be like economic boycotts, refusing to shop at a particular store. Or in the case of what King did in the 50s, leading a boycott against a particular bus line, in this case, the city of Montgomery's like public transit, because they were segregated, because African Americans had to sit in the very back of buses or train cars or whatever throughout the South. Of course, that was just a part of Jim Crow, and they wanted to change that, so they did it by trying to put pressure on the Birmingham bus system by refusing to ride it. So things like that, picketing or sit-ins. There are a lot of famous examples of sit-ins during the civil rights movement. One that you might be familiar with, I grew up learning about it because I'm actually from this area, but in Greensboro, North Carolina, there was a famous sit-in at a Woolworth lunch counter that you might be familiar with. That happened, I believe, in the early to mid 60s, but African Americans weren't served there. They weren't allowed to go in there and order a cup of coffee. They couldn't sit in the same area, where white people could sit. So a group of African American college students from a nearby HBCU went to the lunch counter and sat there even though they were being refused service. And the people who worked there were sort of telling them to leave. They refused to leave. Again, they were nonviolent. So they just sat there. They took no, violent action, of course, but this enraged many people, and they were subjected to a lot of insults. People poured coffee and threw food at them. The police, I think, eventually came. And a lot of this civil disobedience or direct action, nonviolent direct action, would lead to a lot of the activists getting arrested, and going to jail. That was just kind of part of it. And King and his followers knew that. And there was actually kind of a training regimen for anybody who wanted to get involved with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which he mentions here. That's like the larger organization that he was president of. If you wanted to get involved in these kinds of protests or demonstrations or sit-ins, you kind of had to go in knowing that there was at least a decent chance that there was going to be violence inflicted upon you, A, and then B, a very good chance that you would eventually be arrested and perhaps spend the night in jail, which is, of course, what's happening to King here, right? He's in jail while he's writing this. I believe the exact offense was maybe they were demonstrating without a permit or something like that. There were a lot of trumped up charges that southern towns and cities would bring against these demonstrations so they could lock up civil rights leaders and participants, which is exactly what happened here. So these are just examples of nonviolent direct action. So any kind of a demonstration where people have signs, they're out in the street, they're drawing attention to themselves. And also, you guys might be familiar with the Freedom Rides, which took place in the South during the 1960s. This was considered kind of a more confrontational form of nonviolent direct action. Another thing we should remember is that King's organization that he references several times here, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, that was not the only civil rights organization putting together these types of demonstrations and protests. And in fact, King and the SCLC, that's like sort of the abbreviation we often see for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, they were often criticized by other groups for not being like extreme enough, or maybe extreme's not the right word. King objects to that word, certainly, in the letter, but they were sometimes criticized for being maybe a little too conservative, not forceful enough, not aggressive enough in some of their tactics. So there was another civil rights organization that King sort of engaged with and, had some dealings with, but they were separate, and sometimes they were slightly at odds. And I don't know if he references them, but maybe the intro does. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, often abbreviated as SNCC, SNCC is how that's often pronounced, I think. And a lot of those members were a bit younger, maybe a little bit further like to the left politically, and they thought King and the SCLC was actually moving a little bit too slowly and not taking enough direct action to really create positive change in the South. So you got to remember there was a spectrum during this time. So King's getting criticized really from multiple angles. He's getting criticized by these white religious leaders for pushing too hard for change and adopting too many examples of nonviolent direct action. And then on the other side, he's getting criticized by organizations like SNCC for not going far enough, not doing enough, not being sort of confrontational enough. Again, SNCC was still nonviolent. That's even in their title, right? The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. But they were the ones who organized the famous freedom rides that you might have read about during the 1960s. And the whole idea was they would get white civil rights demonstrators or activists, often from northern cities, to ride interstate bus lines along with African Americans, because in the Jim Crow South, that was against the law. Whites and blacks couldn't ride together. They couldn't sit together on these interstate buses. So they were breaking that law. They were very consciously and deliberately breaking that law, knowing full well that they were going to be hassled by cops. They were going to be stopped. In many cases, they were thrown into jail. And they knew that, and that was kind of part of the plan. They were sort of trying to create a little bit of confrontation just to draw attention to the fact that, the Jim Crow South was still very restrictive. And it was actually often in violation of federal law because the federal government had already mandated that segregation end. And a lot of southern states were not complying with federal law. So again, this kind of goes back to what King was saying. He was like, yeah, we break laws, but only the bad ones, only the local laws that are often clearly unjust and maybe even in opposition to certain federal law. But anyway, you guys might have heard that some of those freedom riders were murdered by perhaps the KKK or other, sort of racist opponents in the Deep South, in Mississippi, maybe Alabama as well. So it did turn violent. And in some cases, the buses were attacked. In other cases, individuals would be attacked if they were going into a hotel or getting some food or something. It was very fraught. And again, it was dangerous. And a lot of people criticized it because they said you're inviting controversy, you're inviting confrontation, and you're really prompting a violent reaction. And King sort of addresses that criticism as well. Again, he wasn't doing the freedom rides himself. He wasn't maybe pushing quite as hard as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, but he was getting criticized for his direct action as well. The boycotts, the protests, the demonstrations. Critics like the white clergymen were saying, that's not the way to do it. If you want to address inequality, you need to go through the courts. You need to go through the legal system, maybe sort of, enter into local negotiations with local town, city, state leaders. Maybe do it through legislation, but you shouldn't protest in the streets or demonstrate or break certain laws, even if you're doing it nonviolently, because that invites violence. That was sort of the clergyman's argument. So what I want us to kind of start with today as we analyze the letter is really thinking about how King responds to the clergyman, how he sort of refutes their argument point by point. So we can really think about the letter on two levels, and that's how I want to structure the rest of today's lecture. First, I want us to think about it as sort of a rhetorical exercise, just thinking about it as an argument, a really well-reasoned, well-researched, well-organized argument. I've actually taught this before in English 102, which is a class that's very much kind of built around argumentative writing, because it's a great example of an argument, just a really sound, detailed argument with lots of evidence to support it. So we can read it that way. We can pick out some specific rhetorical strategies that King is using here. And again, when I say rhetoric or rhetorical, I'm really just talking about argument. How is he making an argument? Because remember, he's responding to critics who made their argument against him and against the SCLC and against their nonviolent direct action. So now he's responding kind of point by point and making a lot of strong points. And again, we can see how he does that. So we'll start by looking at some rhetorical strategies, and then I want us to think about it more along the lines of literary strategies. I want us to think more about certain literary elements or characteristics that we can identify at work in the text. Again, things that we might also expect to find in a novel, or a short story, or a play, or maybe even a poem. So let's start with the rhetorical strategies. And he kind of lays this out in the beginning. Again, he's specifically addressing the clergymen. So he is talking to them, but like we said before, he's really talking to everybody in a larger sense. And just, I wanted to just kind of finish my point about the SCLC. He was the president of that organization, and he would remain president until he was assassinated at the end of the 60s. And another thing that's important, they might mention this in the intro, but again, just keep it in mind as context. He believed, and his followers believed, that churches should be involved in political action. And that was controversial back then. It might still be controversial today. Not even all African American civil rights leaders necessarily agreed with that. And certainly a lot of white people at the time did not agree. So again, we often have this sort of sanitized version of King where everybody celebrates him. You'd be hard-pressed to find a lot of people who would, say anything really negative about him or what he was doing today. But that wasn't the case back then. He had a lot of critics. The FBI was surveilling him. He was viewed in some ways as being sort of dangerous, like certain parts of the U.S. government and certainly established parts of society. Many people within those channels viewed him as kind of dangerous because he wanted some pretty drastic change. And that always makes a lot of people uncomfortable. So let's just keep that in the back of our minds, right? He's responding to criticism and he's making an argument. So if we're thinking about some of his rhetorical strategies, we can kind of start with a couple of key words that he cites throughout. And he's actually quoting the clergymen themselves because they accused him and his movement and his participation, just sort of his presence in Birmingham altogether, as being unwise and untimely. So he's interested in those words. He returns to those words a couple of times, and he really wants to debunk the notion that he shouldn't be there. He mentions that the clergymen say, these are outsiders coming in. They don't belong here. They're inserting themselves into our local politics. That shouldn't happen. And King has a very logical, reasonable response to that. He says, I was invited. My organization works with people here, in Birmingham, Alabama. He was based in Atlanta. That's where the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was based. But they were obviously networking. They obviously worked with a lot of other civil rights groups throughout the South, as he points out. And the SCLC also had chapters in a lot of different, or branches, locations, in a lot of different places. Atlanta was their home base, but they went other places. So he's kind of making that point. He said, I was invited here. I participate with a larger movement, and of course, injustice somewhere. it equals injustice everywhere on some sort of larger level. So he answers that, and he sort of just addresses the basic question of why am I here. He kind of starts there, and then he'll return to those key words of unwise and untimely to show that he's really being neither. Okay, so that's kind of strategy number one, a direct response to very specific charges made by the clergymen in their letter. Okay, then he moves on to what we might just call colloquially logic at the bottom of page 481. So yeah, make sure you read the intro to King to give you some of this context that I've been summarizing, and then the letter itself starts on 481. So on the bottom of that page, the paragraph that begins with "you deplore the demonstrations." Take a look at this. This is a famous passage, and he's talking a little bit about cause and effect, and he's making a very important point. He says, "You deplore the demonstrations taking place in Birmingham, but your statement, I am sorry to say, fails to express a similar concern for the conditions that brought about the demonstrations." So then if you turn the page, he goes on to say, and again, notice his tone here. It's very effective. He's making the case that surely the clergymen would not be making this sort of logical mistake or this fallacy of only focusing on causes without also being interested in the effects that bring about those causes. Or the effects, that came from the causes. All right, to only be concerned with causes. No, I'm getting it backwards. He says, surely you're not content with the superficial kind of social analysis that deals merely with effects and does not grapple with the underlying causes. So that's what I meant to say. That's the causal chain that he's sort of referencing here. He's like, the demonstrations are the effects, right? The causes are, the larger sort of institutional racism at work in this place. And the fact that there's really no chance for the African American community to negotiate or to try to bring about change in any other way, right? That's really how he concludes that paragraph at the top of 482. He says the city's white power structure has left the Negro community with no alternative. So he's saying, again, if you only focus on the demonstrations, again, the nonviolent direct action that the civil rights activists are engaged in, if you're only focused on that and you're not looking at causes, the underlying causes that created the demonstrations, then you're really engaging in a superficial kind of social analysis. But he makes sure to be a little bit more delicate than that. He's not directly accusing the clergymen of engaging in that superficial, shallow social analysis. He's saying, surely you're not. Surely you're not doing that. But of course, his point is, that's exactly what you're doing. You're only focusing on effects. You're not looking at causes. But that's a clever way of making that criticism without making it sound like too harsh of a criticism. Because when we turn to the literary strategies, although we might also think this is a rhetorical strategy, we're going to notice his tone, his voice, his point of view, because he's really threading a delicate needle here. He needs the support of a lot of white religious and political leaders. So while he is offering critique and he is responding and he is criticizing at times, and he's pretty frank in his language at times, he's also careful, I think, to not burn bridges, to maintain a very civil, very diplomatic tone. And there's still this kind of hopefulness, this optimism that pervades the whole text that I think appeals to people. So again, that's all sort of related to literary strategies if we can kind of think of him as a narrator. And he is sort of delivering a narrative here as the storyteller. But again, this isn't a story in the traditional sense. This is real. But we will notice that there's overlap between the rhetorical strategies and what we might call the literary strategies. They are not mutually exclusive. But, we'll go through them separately first, and then we can perhaps find ways that they bleed into each other or borrow from each other. Okay, so just a little bit of logic there. That was kind of the second rhetorical strategy that I identified. And then if you flip over, and you guys might be able to find more, I just have sort of a rough checklist here to kind of go through. On 483, you'll find another one. Again, he often has sort of, very sophisticated in terms of his examples, his evidence, some of his style, but his structure is kind of deceptively simple. He'll often open paragraphs or new sections of the letter by just simply responding to a question. He'll pose a question, or he might repeat a question that he, heard from the clergyman, or that he imagines the clergyman or other white moderates or potential critics might level at him. And he answers the question. So he does this near the top of 483, and the first full paragraph on that page. He says, "You may well ask, why direct action? Why sit-ins, marches, and so forth? Isn't negotiation a better path?" So now, again, he's almost directly quoting the clergyman, or at least he's referencing their ideas. They're saying, you guys should negotiate. Or you guys should go through legal channels. You shouldn't engage in these demonstrations that invite or sort of provoke violent reactions. So King's going to answer why, the question as to why are they doing the things that they're doing. And again, this is just kind of good, clear logic and common sense. He says this is actually the only way that we can negotiate. There's no other avenue towards negotiation. The white power structure will not really sit down and have a good faith conversation with us. We have to sort of force the issue. And we force the issue through sit-ins, boycotts, demonstrations. That sort of gets people's attention. Yes, it causes tension. It might cause some conflict, but he's arguing that sometimes that's what we need. Sometimes we need some tension. Of course, it must be nonviolent tension. He never advocates for violence. He never claims that the demonstrators or the activists should ever resort to any violent action. And he remains dedicated against that, staunchly opposed to that throughout his whole career. But he says tension can be okay as long as it's nonviolent tension, because tension forces change. Tension forces people to maybe rethink some assumptions, or to maybe just finally sit down and hear what the other side has to say. So again, he's arguing for some of the reasons behind their tactics, but he's also making a really important larger point, which is this is the only way we can negotiate. This is another very effective rhetorical strategy, is he often agrees with his critics. He's like, you're right, negotiation is important. And this is how we get it. This is the only way that we can get it. And unless you have a better idea, which of course the clergymen did not, then we're going to have to continue to pursue this method. So very effective, not only justifying the methods, but also making the point that these methods will lead to the desired outcome that even the white clergymen want, right? Negotiation, stuff happening behind closed doors, stuff happening in the courtroom, or some legislative body, not violent, not dangerous, kind of using our institutions and systems of democratic government and law. So very effective strategy there. Moving on, so he goes back to that idea of untimely. If you look a little further down that same page, the last full paragraph on page 483, again, he's going right back to the clergyman's letter and responding to specific things they say in there. One of the basic points in your statement is that the action that I and my associates have taken in Birmingham is untimely. So King is very interested in the concept of time. This is actually something that he talks about on a couple of different occasions in two sort of different ways in the letter. So he does a couple of things here with this particular point, this particular aspect of his argument. First, and this is kind of in the weeds, and if you don't know much about local, like Alabama politics in the 60s, it's easy to sort of miss this one. But what he's saying, first of all, is, again, you're criticizing me for being untimely. In other words, being too rash, trying to move too fast. That's a big argument that the clergymen made and other critics were making. They said, hey, don't push it. Okay, even people who agreed that segregation needed to end, the Jim Crow South needed to reform, they said, hey, it takes time. It takes time. You can't push people and make them act too quickly. So take time, be patient, wait. Again, we see that word repeated a lot, wait a little bit longer. And he's basically saying, here are the reasons why we can't wait any longer. Here's why the time for action is now. So kind of his first reason is he's talking about the new elected city government of Birmingham. And he's saying, these people aren't going to work with us. Like, these people are committed segregationists. Like, they're really no different than the previous government. They might be a little bit more gentle in their methods, but they still believe in the same things. They are committed to segregation. They're not interested in negotiating with us. They're not interested in instituting any significant change. So what good is it going to do for us to wait around? Because that's something the clergymen said. They're like, well, give this new government a chance. Give this new local government a chance. See what they're going to do about it. And maybe they'll cooperate with you. And King is simply offering his opinion that they will not. They are no different from the previous regime. They're not interested in talking to us. So we have to kind of push the envelope through our nonviolent direct action. And then he goes on to make sort of a larger point. And this encompasses a really famous passage of the letter. So if you flip over to 484, you see the continuation of this longer sort of conversation, this longer consideration of the word wait and what it means to be told to wait. To be told to wait for freedom, wait for equality, wait for opportunity. And again, this might put us a little bit in mind of Lorraine Hansberry and A Raisin in the Sun, some of the concepts that we talked about and some of the ideas and current events of the mid-20th century that we talked about in relation to that play. But just mark that place in the letter. We're going to come back to 484, that really long paragraph in the middle of 484 when we talk about literary techniques. But this particular passage is really all about the concept of waiting and what it means to have to keep waiting and how it feels for African Americans to be told that as they continue to live, in an unequal society. So we'll come back to that page. But again, he's directly addressing this notion of being untimely. And he's basically making the case that he's not untimely. The time is now. But he doesn't just say that in a statement or two. He makes a sort of multi-pronged point. One that's very localized and specific to Birmingham politics at this moment when he's writing. And then the other point that's much larger, almost like universal or national. And it really speaks to the larger African American experience in the middle of the 20th century. All right, so moving on, the next rhetorical strategy that I thought was significant comes right after the passage we were looking at the very bottom of 484. And again, he's addressing this idea of breaking laws or, civil disobedience. At the very bottom of the page, he says, you express a great deal of anxiety over our willingness to break laws. And again, he's giving them a little bit of ground, always an effective rhetorical strategy. This is certainly a legitimate concern. He acknowledges that everybody can't just go around breaking laws all the time if we truly want a civil society. But look what he does next. He mentions the Supreme Court's 1954 decision outlawing segregation. Again, sort of subtly making this point that a lot of the laws that exist in the South, they're not even in accordance with federal law, right? They're the lawless ones. Often these white power structures in places like Birmingham, they were breaking laws. They were refusing to do what the Supreme Court was telling them to do, what the federal government was telling them to do. And we discussed this weeks ago when a lot of these states were when these states were forced to integrate schools. Often the National Guard had to be called out, not only because local people were opposed to it, but in some cases local mayors or governors or other elected officials would try to physically block the school entrance so African American students could not enter. So in some cases, the federal government had to send troops just to make sure that these kids could go to school. I mean, we probably read something about that at some point in our own schooling, but it's important to kind of keep that in mind when you're thinking about King's argument. And then once again, he likes to start localized. He likes to start with something specific with a lot of these rhetorical points, and then he'll move into something bigger, broader, more universal. And he does the same thing here, drawing largely on some philosophical concepts, talking about the differences between just and unjust laws. So that's another kind of famous rhetorical strategy that he uses. And that goes on for a while. Again, it starts right there at the bottom of 484, and he really continues to talk about it until page 487. So he devotes a lot of time and space to sort of justifying why they are breaking certain laws. And again, there was a long tradition, and he's a part of it, and he makes that clear with some of his references and allusions to other thinkers, other leaders throughout history. If we keep going through our rhetorical strategies, we'll find some more logic over on page 487. So once he finally gets finished with the law point, around the middle of 487, he really returns to something that we would just call kind of common sense or basic logic. Again, commonly cited as a famous example of him very effectively refuting the white clergyman's arguments. This is the very middle of the page. In your statement, you assert that our actions, even though peaceful, must be condemned because they precipitate violence. So again, what the clergymen were saying was, look, you're causing problems because white people are coming out and being violent to you because you're making them so mad by demonstrating or doing these sit-ins or these boycotts. And King says, but, okay, I mean, I hear you. I hear that you're saying that. But then he goes on to ask, is this a logical assertion? And of course it's not. He says, isn't this like condemning a robbed man because his possession of money precipitated the evil act of robbery? So again, he's saying the people who are committing the violence are the white people opposed to, what we're doing. So how can the blame rest with us when the violence is being committed by others? And largely the violence is being committed just because of sort of who we are or what we possess, and sort of just basic tenets. So again, he goes on, he has a lot of examples. Isn't this like condemning Jesus? Because his unique God consciousness and never ceasing devotion to God's will precipitated the evil act of crucifixion. So again, he's saying you can't punish the robbed, you punish the robber, right? You don't punish the victim, typically. You punish the perpetrator of the crime, the perpetrator of the violence. And again, this logic holds, I think, even if, even in the cases where the activists might have been breaking certain laws or like local laws enforcing segregation, like riding buses in an integrated way. King might say, yeah, they're breaking a law, but it's an unjust law. And that doesn't justify white people exacting violence on them, right? One thing doesn't necessarily equal the other. So again, that's a specific point that the clergymen make. They're saying, look, we appreciate that you're nonviolent, but you're precipitating violence. The stuff that you're doing is leading to violence. And he says, but that's not how we see most other situations, right? That's not generally how the legal system works, right? If somebody has violence done to them because of who they are or what they have or even what they want, we don't typically punish the victim. We punish whoever exacts the violence on the person, on the victim. So most people would agree with that, right? I mean, that's logic, but it's also, I think it just tracks as common sense to most people, because that's generally how we think about crime and punishment. So he's using logic and common sense once again to strengthen his argument. And then at the bottom of 487, he gets back in to the notion of time. And he says, I had also hoped that the white moderate would reject the myth concerning time in relation to the struggle for freedom. So he gets into this larger discussion about how time is kind of like value neutral, right? Because again, they were being told to wait, be patient. Some of this change will come, but it's just going to take a long time. And King's saying, but again, that's not really logical, is it? Because things don't automatically get better with time. Time is neutral. Time can be used for good things, but time can also be used for bad things. So the forward march of time doesn't really guarantee anything. It could bring good, it could also bring bad, but this idea that we have to wait in order to get what we want doesn't really make sense. I mean, we could wait and only see things continue the way they've been for a long time, right? He's already drawn attention to just how long African Americans have already been waiting for their sort of, constitutional rights to be respected, for their rights as citizens to be respected and honored equitably. So he's saying, clearly just waiting around hasn't been the most effective strategy so far. It's been several hundreds of years. So there's no guarantee that if we wait longer, it's automatically going to get better. We have to take action. We have to do things. We have to make sure that we're using time in a positive way in order to get these desired outcomes. So that's another famous thing that people often talk about, kind of an extended sort of treatise on time and how, this whole notion of waiting doesn't really hold up. And then I really like what he does at the top of 488, another really effective rhetorical strategy, getting into definition and thinking about the actual meaning of a word. So he mentions in the first full paragraph on 488, again, directly referencing something the clergyman had said, you speak of our activity in Birmingham. I was extreme. You speak of our activity in Birmingham as extreme. So he's getting into the actual meaning of that word. And he says, at first, I was kind of taken aback by your word choice. And then he gets into, like I said, this larger spectrum of what we might think of as the civil rights movement, because it's not all the same. And again, I think sometimes our modern conception of it is that all of these civil rights activists were working together. They all agreed on most major things, and they were all sort of working in concert all the time. But King wants to draw attention to the fact that that's not true. That there are elements, that there are groups and organizations that might be considered more extreme than him and the SCLC. He's saying, I'm actually standing in between these different currents, these sort of opposing forces within the larger sort of struggle for African American equality. And if you ignore my group, if you ignore our nonviolent direct action, there are other groups. And he mentions Elijah Muhammad's Muslim movement, the Nation of Islam in particular. There are groups who are not as opposed to violence as we are. There are groups that you might think of as even more extreme than us. And if you can't work with us, if you can't negotiate with us, you might find that you are confronted with more sort of dire situations. So another important point that I think sometimes gets a little bit lost on modern readers who don't always have a clear sense of all these different kind of groups, and they didn't all agree, within the larger civil rights struggle. So, a little Googling or Wikipediaing is never a bad thing when you're coming across some stuff like that. So again, he's sort of saying, work with us because you're going to have a better chance than working with some of these other groups who are very angry. And they're only getting more angry as we have to wait longer. And it's not a threat per se, but it's sort of like a bit of a prediction about what, potentially could happen down the line if certain changes don't occur. So sort of interested in what that word means and how it might be connected to a sort of broader spectrum of this sort of larger struggle. And then that was kind of it. I think I had maybe two more on. So 490, just kind of like an organizational sort of principle. He lists out a lot of his major disappointments. And again, he starts the first full paragraph on 490 very clearly. Let me take note of my other major disappointments. So he's already been talking about them for a while. He lists out several more now, sort of going through all the ways that the white moderates who on the surface support, integration and a more equitable society, how they have let him down, how they've let the movement down through complacency or just a sort of moral cowardice or an unwillingness to really confront some of the uglier realities of Jim Crow and really try to bring about change. And then finally, a point that often gets repeated that he makes near the end, and this also kind of leads us into another example of a really powerful bit of sort of literary language, we might call it, or something that at least we'll find a lot in literature. He makes this point that the destiny of African Americans is really inextricably tied to the destiny of the larger country. It is, it's one and the same, right? That's what he says. Abused and scorned though we may be, this is on 492, near the bottom of the page. Abused and scorned though we may be, our destiny is tied up with America's destiny. Before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth, we were here. Before the pen of Jefferson etched the majestic words of the Declaration of Independence across the pages of history, we were here. So again, he's talking about history. He's talking about how African Americans had been in the U.S. long before it was the U.S., really from the very beginning of European colonialism in what was then called the New World. So he's making this point that America cannot fully realize its potential or fully enact all the wonderful freedoms promised by the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence unless African Americans finally get their share. So again, a sort of a famous move that he made a lot in his speeches, not rejecting the founding documents of America, but rather saying, let's live up to them by finally providing those things for all people in this country, not just some people. So he makes that sort of move, that rhetorical move a lot throughout his career, and he makes it here. But also that repetition and that similar structure as he goes through those sentences is very powerful, memorable, and often recited. So that's pretty much it for the rhetorical strategies. Now we can move into some of the literary strategies that he's employing. And again, there's going to be overlap. We're going to notice that these two categories bleed into each other in a lot of ways. And I would encourage you guys to maybe think about some of the ways that the rhetorical or the argumentative can become literary. And also think about ways that the literary can enhance or somehow improve upon the argumentative. See how these two kind of different strains or different types of writing can not only coexist, but also kind of work together and almost combine forces in various ways to achieve larger goals. But just before I forget, I wanted to point out there's a lot of footnotes here. At times, this might even read a little bit like an academic text because he references a lot of other thinkers. He's drawing on a lot of other academic disciplines. Again, something that people might sometimes lose sight of with King. We know he was a minister, a reverend, obviously a religious leader, but a lot of people don't know that he was also a trained theologian, meaning he had his PhD in theology. He was a very learned man, very well read, a very gifted writer, in addition to being a great orator. But he's really showing sort of the breadth of his learning and the breadth of his knowledge. And I don't think he's doing it in an overly sort of ostentatious or showy way. But also remember that he's writing this letter in a jail cell. So I don't think he had access to a lot of his books. There was no internet back then. He couldn't do a quick Google search to remind himself of some reference. So we have to assume, and of course he probably went back and revised later, but we have to assume that a lot of his references, a lot of the allusions, a lot of the things that he's quoting or citing really come from memory, or he just is so familiar with a lot of that material that he can speak about it at length, kind of offhand. I mean, he had a sort of impressive intellect that I don't think always gets acknowledged as much, because we focus more on sort of his powerful orations, his gifts as a speaker, and of course those are considerable. But he was also a PhD in theology, and he draws upon that, has almost an encyclopedic knowledge of the Bible. But also he mentions other religious leaders. He mentions philosophers. He talks about history. He mentions T.S. Eliot, a famous poet and essayist. So he's showing how well read he is, how learned he is. So just, pay attention to that. He's drawing upon ethics, legal theory, philosophy, obviously religion, and even a little bit of literature to make some of his points. And a lot of that gets reflected in those footnotes that I'm hoping that you are reading. So now let's point out some literary strategies as well. So I wanted to start, like I've said already, with voice. We can think of this kind of as point of view. We often talk about point of view when discussing fiction, right? We talk about the narrator. What kind of narrator do we have? Is it a first-person narrator or a third-person narrator? If it's third person, is it omniscient? Is the narrator reliable? Can we trust the narrator? Is the narrator lying to us? And a lot of postmodern fiction, the narrator might be deceiving us intentionally or not. And of course, this is not fiction. But King is sort of telling us a narrative. And he can be viewed as a narrator. And he is certainly the speaker. This is all delivered in his voice. It's kind of an academic voice at times, but it can also be a very moving, emotionally effective voice as well. So we can think about his point of view or how he sort of serves as a narrator here. And another thing to keep in mind, if we're thinking about him as a narrator, we should think about how he's addressing readers, because that's something, of course, that narrators often do. And we've actually seen a lot of examples of this, or at least a few. We saw Vonnegut's narrator kind of directly addressing readers in the opening to Slaughterhouse-Five, and we mentioned that one thing that a lot of postmodern writers from the late 20th century like to do was to kind of play around with that relationship between the narrator and the audience, and maybe have the narrator be a little bit quirky or talk directly to the audience, or have those sort of moments, like confessional moments, where they're talking about the actual writing or telling of the story. So kind of collapsing some of the traditional walls or barriers that would have kept the narrator sort of separate, the literary world separate from the real world. And we might see that King is doing something a little bit similar here. I mean, again, he's specifically addressing the clergyman. But again, how can he do that in a way that actually addresses all of us? That's something to consider or think about a little bit more. We could also just think about his style or his sentence structure. So this brings us back to that famous passage that I mentioned on 484. Maybe you've read this before or you're familiar with it. I'm not going to read the whole thing now, but I just want to point out this one very long sentence that constitutes most of the very long paragraph in the middle of page 484. So this very long sentence starts with, "But when you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers." Okay, start there. It comes right after the word wait. They're being told, wait a little bit longer. Okay, so start with that sentence beginning with, "But when you have seen vicious mobs." And then if you notice, that sentence continues without a break all the way down to a repetition of that word wait near the end of the paragraph after the dash. Then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait. That's where the sentence ends. Now notice all the different examples, all the different imagery that he offers within that one very long sentence. You might also notice the punctuation that he's using to join together all of these different clauses, all of these different examples. He's creating this really powerful sort of accumulation of examples, indignities, the types of indignities or humiliations that African Americans were subjected to on a daily basis in the Jim Crow South. And as we know, in other parts of the country too, like the South Side of Chicago. So he goes through this litany, this long list. Notice the language. Notice the imagery. Notice word choice. Notice all of that. Notice how it builds up momentum. And then we reach the end of that sentence, once again, with the word wait. You will understand why we find it difficult to wait. So that's not how all of his sentences are, obviously, but you might notice some similarities when you're looking at his style and his sentence structure compared to maybe Kerouac's at times. Maybe somewhat similar in terms of organization, other structural patterns, this idea of image after image, impression after impression, example after example, one sort of piled onto another. We notice how in some of Kerouac's sentences, again, he's often using punctuation, but there's a lot of clauses, a lot of action, one thing and another thing and another thing and another thing. It creates this kind of breathless effect that we said really fits well with the atmosphere of On the Road, because these are sort of wild and crazy people. They're always on the move. They're usually hopped up on amphetamines. So that sort of breathless, breakneck style fit the characters. It certainly fit Dean, and it fit the lifestyle of the people in that book. So think a little bit about how that effect sort of translates here. Like, how does King's sentence structure reflect his ideas or larger things that we notice about his point of view or his tone? And again, this sentence is pretty famous, right? A lot of his other sentences might strike you as a little bit different, but again, he's often using a pretty complex structure. But also notice the tone, notice that diplomatic tone, while he's also delivering, at times, pretty harsh social criticism. And again, we've seen examples of fiction writers offering social criticism, right? We noticed that maybe Vonnegut was doing that. So they mentioned social analysis as one potential genre that we could assign this text to, but we could also call it social commentary. And we talked about how Vonnegut was doing some of that in his work as well. So there's lots of parallels that you might be able to locate thinking about King in conversation or in relation to some of the other authors that we've already read this semester. But again, just look for stuff that we would look for in fiction or poetry. Look for repetition, because King uses that very effectively. Look for words that get repeated, or look for repeated sentence structures. Sometimes he likes to start multiple sentences with the same words, the same phrasing. Again, that repetition is powerful both on a rhetorical level. It helps us to remember his argument, and it also just kind of sounds good when it's done properly. So it has a sort of aesthetic value or an artistic sort of literary value along with the rhetorical value. So we can notice that. Also, think about individual word choice. I mentioned imagery and also figurative language, because he's using those techniques often much like a fiction writer or a poet would. So you can look for examples of those classic literary elements. Another thing we've talked about before that we can definitely find here, and I've already mentioned them, are allusions. Allusions with an A, right? So these are references to people or things outside the actual reality of the text, right? So with fiction, we often talk about these as sort of being maybe references to like pop culture or things that readers would recognize, but those figures don't necessarily function within the fictive universe, right? They're not like characters necessarily in the story, but they get referenced, they get mentioned. Maybe they're used as a point of comparison. And they're often done so that readers can sort of, see it or something is being made legible or easier to understand for readers. So, for example, with Kerouac, we saw that he had an allusion or a reference to Gene Autry, who was a famous Western actor from the early to mid 20th century. Gene Autry is not a character in On the Road, but Sal is comparing Dean to Gene Autry. And he knows that, and Kerouac knows that his readers know who Gene Autry is. So that's a good way to describe Dean and to give readers sort of a mental image of just what Dean looks like. Really, it's just kind of a physical comparison at that point. So we've seen examples of these before, and we see a lot of references throughout the text. I've already mentioned that he's referencing the Bible. He references a lot of historical figures, but also contemporary figures. He mentions contemporary figures in the civil rights movement, but also figures from earlier in history. But also, on the bottom of 489, for example, he has a brief list of some of the white allies in the South that are actually supporting the civil rights movement. Again, he's very critical of white moderates like the clergymen who say they support it, but then they're like, but wait, don't take nonviolent direct action. But he does give some love to the people who have been more supportive, and he even lists their names at the bottom of 489 and the top of 490. Those aren't footnotes. He just goes ahead and references those directly in the text. But oftentimes there are other references to, passages from the Bible, historical figures, philosophical concepts or writers. And we have a lot of footnotes because a lot of that stuff might not be familiar to us, but he's using all of that both to make his argument, but also it just creates a more rich, interesting, and diverse landscape. So in some cases, he's using a lot of these references for the same reasons that fiction writers would use them. To make comparisons, to give readers more to think about, to provide a little bit more detail or context. So again, they have a rhetorical value. They're often being used in support of his argument, in support of specific claims and points that he's making. But at the same time, references kind of always register in a somewhat literary way, or at least they function in a way that's similar to what we see in literature. It's a chance to reflect on some larger ideas, a chance to make connections, a chance to, in some ways, kind of step out for just a moment, maybe step out of the very specific world of the text and think about real world connections, other comparisons, other sort of wavelengths. That's often what it does for us in lit, and I think that's what a lot of these references do for us here in this text as well. Okay, so we will wrap things up today by just mentioning genre very briefly, because we talked a lot about genre last week in relation to sci-fi, fantasy, and the rise of genre fiction. So they also mention genre here in the intro. If you go back to the little intro on 4 that begins on 479, but at the very bottom on 480, they mention that this is a classic example of American prison writing, protest writing, religious writing, memoir, and social analysis. So I think we should consider all of those different genre categories because they're interesting, and you guys might be able to find or think of other examples that you might be familiar with of those genres. So protest writing, there's a long history of protest writing in the U.S., going all the way back to our colonial past. You could think about figures like Thomas Paine. You could think about other people who were fighting for some kind of cause. Obviously, civil rights leaders. You could think about leaders of the feminist movement, leaders of the Native American sort of equality movement. All different kinds of movements often have writing associated with them. Prominent figures sort of setting out their claims, setting out their arguments, their complaints, sort of addressing the injustice that they suffer from, and perhaps offering potential remedies. So you might want to think a little bit more about protest writing as a genre. And of course, it doesn't just exist in the US. You can find examples from other countries, other parts of the world as well. Religious writing. Obviously, King is a religious figure. He's a church leader. So you can place it within that larger tradition. Think about other religious leaders. I mean, he was named after Martin Luther, a pretty important religious leader, part of the leader of the Protestant Reformation in Europe. So who are some other important religious leaders throughout history, or maybe just throughout U.S. history, that have some famous writing that we might be able to look at or at least just think about? Prison writing. That's another interesting genre that we can consider, and you guys might want to do a little bit of research into it. There's other examples of prison writing. Essays, maybe fiction, but stuff that's getting written in prison by people who are incarcerated. So these might be sort of personal writing, but in other cases they could fall under some of those, traditional categories of literature. But whether it's fiction, nonfiction, a novel, a memoir, an essay, a letter like this, all have certain things in common based on where they're being written, the conditions under which they're being written, and the social position of the writer. Having their freedom taken away, being incarcerated for various reasons, right? King is being incarcerated for pretty trumped up reasons here. In other cases of prison writing, the person doing the writing might have committed a pretty heinous crime. But there are similarities, and that's a pretty coherent genre that you can look into more. Just to think of one figure off the top of my head, Leonard Peltier, a well-known Native American activist who spent a lot of time in prison and wrote extensively about the struggle for Native American rights and freedom. And he actually has a volume of, I think, collected writings that he composed during his time while he was incarcerated. There's many, many others, so you guys can just kind of go down that rabbit hole if you are interested. Also, memoirs. That's a pretty familiar genre, right? Very personal writing. We can find a lot of examples, past and present, and this could fall under that category as well. And we mentioned, finally, social analysis and commentary. Obviously, he's engaging in that. He is analyzing certain problems. He's offering some potential solutions. He's talking about methods that need to be taken in order to achieve solution. He's providing commentary, some pretty pointed critiques, right? He is criticizing people, but I think he's always doing it in a pretty productive way, in a constructive way. And he's ultimately looking for collaboration. He's looking for partnerships. He's looking for solutions to these social ills. And that's what a lot of good social analysis and social commentary tries to do. And as we've said, a lot of fiction writers were engaged in that same type of activity. Maybe not the same subject matter, maybe not the exact same cause, but a lot of literature can also function as social commentary or social analysis. And we can certainly see how this functions that way. So look for some more of this stuff. Again, you might be more interested in the rhetorical side, or you might be a little bit more interested in the literary side, or you might want to do more to find ways that these two sides meet, how they combine or overlap. And feel free to do a little bit more research into those genres. I think you might be interested in at least some of those. Okay, so that's it for this week. I will see you next week as we get started on social. Not social, literary criticism and theory. So I'll see you then.